Hello and welcome back to my channel. I am so glad you decided to click on this video. Today I'm going to talk about how to get started with Stephen King books. So I've had so many people say that they want to start reading Stephen King, but they are just clueless as to where to begin because he has so many books, so many series, and it's just very intimidating to know where to begin with all of his backlist. So I wanted to kind of first start by pointing out how Stephen King is so much more than just horror books. He has the reputation for being a horror author, which he absolutely is, and he definitely shines and is one of the best to ever do it, but he can do it all. There's plenty of other stuff that he's good at, and I am so excited to share that with you. The first Stephen King book that I ever read was 11/22/63, which is not horror. If anything, it's kind of sci-fi. I read this for the first time in 2016, and it remains my favorite book of all time. Highly suggest reading it, but we will get to that later. I have read it at least 5 times, so clearly a big fan. I'd also like to start by saying that, a little disclaimer, many of King's characters are not good people, and this is reflected in their words and actions. In most, if not all of his books, there is derogatory language, offensive behavior, and situations that will just give you the ick. And I want to be very clear that this is not a reflection of King's beliefs or values. If you're sensitive to that, or just have a hard time separating the art from the artist, that's totally fine. It's your right to do so, but I will suggest maybe a couple books closer to the end of the video that might be more your speed. Now, I actually hadn't read any of his horror books until 2019. Until 2019, the only Stephen King books that I had read were 11/22/63 and the Bill Hodges Mr. Mercedes trilogy. My first horror book that I read by Stephen King was Carrie, and that is where I will begin this video with recommendations. So Carrie was the first novel that Stephen King had published, although it was not the first one that he wrote. This is a pretty short book. I think it's around 230 pages. And this one is just such a classic. It has such a good film adaptation, and while there are some differences between the book and the movie, I love them both. Although most people probably have an idea of what the plot is, this is about a girl named Carrie White who is in high school. She is a social outcast with a fanatically religious mother. She's constantly being bullied at school, but one girl named Sue kind of feels bad for her, doesn't like how she's treated, and gets her boyfriend to ask Carrie to the prom. Now, throughout her life, Carrie has discovered that she has telekinetic powers, and she's kind of used them to her benefit throughout life, although also not being able to fully control them. So at prom, things go a little sideways, and this has been out for over 50 years, but I will not spoil it in case someone doesn't know what happens. Now, this book isn't necessarily a good showing of King's style of writing because this is written in an epistolary style, so it is written as news articles and letters, which is a style of writing that I actually love, but again, this will still give you a good sense of the overall tone of his books and just the feel of how he writes his stories. Now, the next book I'm going to recommend is one that you might not have heard of. It's called The Girl Who Loved Tom Gordon. This is written in a very, very classic Stephen King style. So I recommend this because it is very representative of the way he writes, in addition to being like around 250 pages. So if you start reading it and, maybe it's not your favorite thing, you can still finish it if you want to and you didn't spend a ton of time on it. Obviously, if you're not feeling something, DNF it. That's my mantra. But it is still short. If you are an anti-DNFer and you don't like it, you don't have to spend a lot of time on it. So I actually really liked this book. This is one I read pretty early on. I had just started to get into Stephen King, and I was at a used bookstore and saw it, and I was like, Tom Gordon, he's a baseball player, and I was like, oh, I'm into it. Let's give it a shot. So this one follows a young girl named Trisha who's on a hike with her brother and her mom. Her mom is going through a divorce and keeps getting into arguments with Trisha's brother, and she ends up falling behind them and kind of getting lost and going off on her own and loses the trail. She is literally surviving off of what she has in her backpack, which is like a few granola bars, a bottle of water, and her Walkman, where she can listen to the Red Sox games, and Tom Gordon is her favorite baseball player. He's a relief pitcher. I mean, at the time he was. And this is like the only thing that's bringing her solace. She's also, trying to listen to anybody that's like talking about her on the radio, like the missing girl. And so it's kind of just survival story. There is a semi-paranormal element-ish, but she starts like hallucinating that Tom Gordon is there talking to her and like giving her advice. And I just think it's a really, really neat story. And again, like very, very typical of the style of writing that Stephen King is known for. I also feel like this book is a lot more creepy and ominous than I'm making it sound, but I'm just gonna leave it there. You're just gonna have to trust me on this one. Next, I'll recommend one of Stephen King's most classic horror novels out there that came out shortly after Carrie, and that is The Shining. I'm wearing my Shining shirt for this video. Side note, Salem's Lot could also fit the bill here, but I personally prefer The Shining, so that's what I'm going to recommend. Again, you're probably somewhat familiar with the plot, but it follows a man named Jack Torrance, who has a traumatic past after growing up with an alcoholic and abusive father. He too is suffering from alcoholism, but he truly wants to change and do right by his wife Wendy and his son Danny, who is 5 years old. The family moves into the Overlook Hotel, which is an isolated hotel up in the Colorado Rockies, to be caretakers for the place when it is closed up for the off-season. Now, 5-year-old Danny possesses something called the Shine or the Shining, which is like a psychic ability that allows him to kind of see the hotel's true nature, to communicate with like other people that have the Shine. And that's obviously where the title of the book comes from. But as winter sets in, the isolation begins to take its toll on Jack's sanity and his ability to stay sober. And he kind of gets pulled into the hotel's dark side, and I'll leave it there. Now, to me, this book perfectly encapsulates what Stephen King does best, which is a completely realized setting. Like, you know, you have a picture in your head, you know exactly what it looks like. There's a lot of slowly building tension where you start to wonder what's real and what's not. Like, you feel like you are in the book, in the character. And everyone's favorite, a morally gray, some further to the dark side, some further to the light side than others, but love a morally gray protagonist. When it comes to horror novels, which, you know, of course is what he is most known for, The Shining is just in a class all its own. Now, if you are more into vampires than like haunted houses, haunted hotels, give Salem's Lot a try. This is a vampire story, and again, it was from the same time period, so it has a lot of the same kind of tone and feel. I personally thought it was maybe like a 3 out of 5, 3.5. So it's definitely not one that I'll ever probably go back and reread. But again, like if you're trying to get an education on Stephen King, you should read it at some point. Now, moving along deeper into the world of Stephen King, it is time to conquer one of his 1,000 plus pagers. The Stand and It are his 2 longest and arguably 2 of his most famous books. I'm personally not a huge fan of It, but I'm definitely in the minority on that one. If you want to be well-versed in Stephen King, I definitely recommend reading them both. However, if you are only going to read one, I personally would recommend The Stand. It is often referred to as Stephen King's magnum opus, so I definitely think that's the way to go. Now, The Stand is about a global pandemic that wipes out nearly the entire world's population. Now, this book is set in the US, so that's where we're focusing, but the survivors that are left in the US start to all kind of have these dreams of either this old woman in Nebraska named Mother Abigail or this man in Las Vegas named Randall Flagg. And when they start to join up with other survivors, they talk about their dreams and they start to kind of form factions and make their way towards Las Vegas or Nebraska. It's kind of weird to when you spell it out like that, but this is an epic. Like, think of the epic poems of the olden days. Like, that is what this is. It is not a poem, obviously, but it is so long. You get such backstory on so many characters, but I was here for every page. I loved soaking up so much about every character. And this is truly a battle of good and evil, and it's just perfection. I honestly advise not reading too much about this and just kind of jump in there and get into it. The beginning is kind of, I don't even want to say slow. There are 2 parts of this where you're starting to get to know the characters and see what led everybody to be a survivor, and then the end where we start to realize some people are good and evil. Anyways, I just told you not to look too much into this, and now I'm explaining more, so I am gonna stop. Moving on. Now, despite my personal opinion, I still do encourage you to read it. If you want to be able to call yourself a fan or a constant reader, as Stephen King superfans are called, then it is a must. This book follows a group of preteens who are being terrorized by an evil entity that takes the form of whatever it is they fear the most. Most often, it appears as Pennywise the Dancing Clown, which is probably, if you've seen the movies, how you picture it. So every 27 years, Pennywise, it comes back to haunt the town of Derry, Maine, and then it goes back into hibernation for another 27 years. So this book has alternating timelines between 1958, when the group that calls themselves the Losers Club first encounters it, and then in 1985 when they go back, reunite, and try to fight it again. Now, this should get you off to a good start with Stephen King. Do not stress about the length of his books and just enjoy the ride that he takes you on with his words. He's absolutely a master of his craft, and he is called the King of Horror for a good reason. Now, when I started planning for this video, it was just gonna be one video, but as I started to write the script and get a little more into it, I realized that there's so much I want to talk about when it comes to Stephen King. So this is actually gonna be a bit of a series, and I hope you stick around. I hope you like what I had to say in this one, and I hope that this was helpful if you are new to Stephen King and just trying to figure out what is what, where to begin. Some of the topics that I'm going to cover in this video series are his short story collections, his non-horror books, book series, Bachman books, which was his pen name, again, we'll explore more later, and different books that are set in particular cities of his own invention. It's likely that I will think of more topics and this will continue on being a bigger series, but I hope that you enjoyed this and it was helpful. I'm always happy to give recommendations if you have a personal interest in something you're looking for. Again, I'm not a super expert on Stephen King, but I've read around 35 to 40 of his books, so I consider myself pretty well versed. But if you like this video, give it a thumbs up. If you aren't subscribed, I would love it if you would, and I will see you in the next one. Bye!